In 1838, the British Association for the Advancement of Science proposed an expedition to carry out magnetic measurements in the Antarctic, strongly supported by the Royal Society, the principal advisors to the government. The proposal was approved. Given his outstanding polar and magnetic exploration experience, Captain James Clark Ross was the obvious choice to lead the expedition. On the 8th of April 1839, Captain Ross was formally appointed to lead the expedition. The saga of the Ross Antarctic expedition is more comprehensively described in my YouTube video, The Great Ice Barrier. Setting out from Hobart, Tasmania on the 12th of November 1840, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sailed via the Auckland and Campbell Islands, crossing the Antarctic Circle and encountering their first iceberg on the 27th of December. That evening, over 15 large tabular icebergs were sighted, up to 60 metres high and 3 kilometres across. 5 days later, they reached the outer edge of the ice pack, beating their way through it until the 8th of January 1841, they entered open water in a large bay that 60 years later was named the Ross Sea. At 2 a.m. on the 11th of January, land was sighted. Captain Ross named the highest peak he could see Mount Sabine, after the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society. In the evening, the ships approached a prominent cape, which Ross named Cape Adair, after his friend Viscount Adair. The mountains behind it, Ross named the Admiralty Range, individual peaks being named after the various lords of the Admiralty. Unsuccessful in his attempt to land at Cape Adair, which, if achieved, would have preceded by over 50 years the first deliberate landing on the Antarctic continent by Karsten Borchgrevink in 1895. Ross turned the ships southeast for the purpose of rounding the eastern extreme of a close body of ice and of getting to leeward of a projecting point of the coast off which we observed several small islands that we expected would afford such protection as to admit of our landing with less difficulty. The southern promontory of the Adair Peninsula was, at the request of Francis Crozier, in command of HMS Terror, named Cape Downshire, after the Marquess of Downshire. Since there is no prominent cape at this location, the area was later renamed the Downshire Cliffs. On the 12th of January 1841, favoured by very fine weather during the night, the two ships succeeded in approaching within 2 or 3 miles of some small islands lying a short distance from the mainland. Zoologist Joseph Hooker noted in his journal one curious rock sticking up among them, which resembled a capstan. At 9 o'clock the next morning, accompanied by several of his officers, Ross left HMS Erebus in charge of Lieutenant Bird and pulled towards the shore in the ship's cutter, followed by Commander Crozier and some of the Terror's officers in a whaleboat. Taking advantage of a narrow opening that appeared in the ice, the boats were pushed through it and got into an eddy under the lee of the largest of the islands. They succeeded in landing on a beach of large loose stones and stranded masses of ice. With the weather turning nasty and the threat of being hemmed in by ice, Ross hastily proceeded with the ceremony of taking possession of the island on behalf of Queen Victoria of Great Britain, witnessed by thousands of aggressive Adelie penguins. The lands he had discovered he called Victoria Land, imaginatively naming the landing place Possession Island. The British flag was unfurled, hoisted, and the Queen's health drunk in a glass of sherry by each of the party, 3 cheers being given on taking possession of the land. Countless clusters of penguins were congregated not only over the beach areas below, but up the sides of the black lava rocks in tier upon tier to the very summit, which attained the height of 90 metres and resembled a bishop's mitre. Surgeon Robert McCormick knocked down an old penguin with his geological hammer and put him in his haversack for the collection, with a few hastily collected specimens of black lava rock. Vigorously attacked by pecking penguins, wading through piles of penguin poo, the party beat a hasty retreat to the boats at 11:15 a.m, having spent only 45 minutes ashore. They pushed back out through heavy surf, rowing vigorously with a strong current flowing south, and rounded the south end of the high ridge by a bluff black headland. A perpendicular wall of basalt lava faced the sea, worn smooth at its base and to a considerable height above it by the action of the waves and the ice. The columns were all most symmetrically vertical. In several places the rocks were perforated with caves. 2 remarkable projections of rock were compared by the sailors to human forms, to which they gave the name Victoria and Albert, presiding over the new land that Ross had just added to their dominions. After a long and heavy pull, the rowers regained their ships at 12:45 p.m, only a short time before a thick fog rolled in with a strong northerly breeze that a few minutes later would have rendered a return to the ships impossible and compelled a return to the shore again to take up quarters with the penguins until the ships could have again approached the island safely. Erebus and Terror then continued their journey south, discovering and naming the erupting Mount Erebus and its companion Mount Terror, then headed east along the Great Ice Barrier. Ross never returned to Possession Island. It was over 50 years before any ship ventured into the same area. Enter Henrik Johan Bull, a Norwegian who had emigrated to Australia in 1885, finding a job with a shipping agent. He saw an opportunity in Melbourne to develop a company to exploit the new whaling grounds discovered by James Clark Ross in the Great Bay off Victoria Land. His attempts at raising finance in Melbourne for an Antarctic expedition failed, but in 1893 Bull travelled to Norway and successfully persuaded his relative Sven Foyn, the Norwegian inventor of the explosive harpoon, to provide the necessary funds. The canny Sven Foyn formed the Antarctic Trading Company in Turnsburg and spread the risk by selling shares in the enterprise to his friends, including Hefti and Sons, Norway's first commercial bankers and the country's leading banking group. Foyn purchased for £2,000, about $420,000 in 2024, a clapped-out, 3-masted, bark-rigged steam sealer, the Cap Nor, of 226 tons, originally built at the Jorgensen and Knutsen yard in Drammen, Norway, in 1871. He renamed it Antarctic. The ship was refurbished at a shipyard in Christiania, present-day Oslo. Work which included replacing the sheathing for the hull, installing a new triple expansion 50 horsepower steam engine, and painting the ship green with a yellow stripe, like all Foyn ships. However, Sven Foyn was not satisfied with the work, so the ship was moved to his own yard in Tønsberg, where the skipper resigned, and was replaced by Captain Leonard Christensen, who had some experience in sealing, but none in whaling, and little practice in ice navigation. By the 18th of September 1893, the ship was ready for sea, fully provisioned for the long voyage and with a full crew complement of 28 seamen. In addition to the regular crew, Henrik Bull also accompanied the vessel as the company's manager. He wrote a book about the voyage, which was published in 1896. Leaving Tønsberg on the 20th of September 1893, the Antarctic steamed via Cape Town to Melbourne, made a farcical attempt at whaling in the Auckland and Campbell Islands, returning to Melbourne on the 21st of August 1894. The publicity and the plans for Antarctic exploration caught the attention of Carsten Egeberg Borchgrevink. Born in 1864 in Oslo, the son of barrister Henrik Borchgrevink and his English wife Annie Ridley, Carsten Borchgrevink studied natural sciences at the Royal Academy of Forestry in Saxony, Germany, before immigrating to Australia in 1888 in search of adventure. He found work on survey teams in Queensland and New South Wales before becoming a science teacher at the Coorwool Academy near Lithgow, west of the Blue Mountains. Perhaps tiring of his teaching duties in Lithgow, Borchgrevink arrived in Melbourne on the 14th of September 1894, and with the help of the Norwegian consul, Hans Gundersen, persuaded Bull to sign him on, ostensibly as a deckhand, but in fact to function as scientist on the expedition. The Antarctic sailed from Melbourne on the 26th of September 1894, stopping at Hobart until the 3rd of October, when she set off for Antarctica, dawdling for a week west of Eddystone Rock, ostensibly looking for sperm whales, without seeing any. After 4 weeks of fruitless cruising, the propeller pin snapped and the ship had to head for Port Chalmers in New Zealand for a replacement. 9 of the crew deserted there, but 4 replacements were recruited in Stewart Island. Antarctic departed Stewart Island on the 28th of November, reaching the pack ice on the 6th of December. For the next 5 weeks they battled the ice pack, roaming west to the Balleny Islands and east almost to 180 degrees, before finally breaking through on the 14th of January 1895. Antarctic then set course for Possession Island, in the hope of meeting there the numerous whales of unusual size described by Sir James Ross. Early on the morning of 17th of January, their first sight of Antarctica was obtained, Mount Sabine, with its summit 3,720 metres in height, overtopping the bold mountain ranges with their numerous peaks and pinnacles. The ship headed towards the most prominent of the partially bare patches of land, Cape Adare, which with its dark sides and snow-streaked top, about 1,200 metres high, formed an excellent landmark. Antarctic arrived under the Cape about noon, but as with Ross in 1841, an easterly gale compelled the ship to haul off and await an improvement in the weather before attempting to land. They ran before the strong breeze towards the west, intending to look for whales off Cape North. The wind reversed to a westerly in the evening, so the course was laid again for the Possession Islands. Bull wrote that the night was enchanting, with the glorious midnight sun illuminating the lofty mountain ranges, which glittered and sparkled with a perfect whiteness. The westerly breeze slackened during the night. Antarctic repassed Cape Adare under sail and steam on the 19th of January. The wind again freshened to half a gale, driving the ship ahead at such great speed that they soon sighted Possession Island. Henrik Bulls photographed the scene as they closed in on the island. It was one of the few of his photos that survived the journey. At 9 p.m, a party consisting of Captain Leonard Christensen, the second mate, the carpenter, Borchgrevink and 3 others rowed ashore to pay a visit to the natives. Thousands of penguins, which could be seen from the deck to occupy nearly the whole extent of Possession Island, which Christensen incorrectly named Sven Foynd Island, as he could find no trace of Ross having been there. Like Ross, they were at once furiously attacked by the penguins, who seemed much annoyed at seeing foreigners intruding on their premises. Carsten Borchgrevink wrote that their hoarse screams filled the air, and it was with considerable strain of my voice that on landing I addressed my countrymen in a few words, informing them that we were the second to set foot on this island. Sir James Ross had preceded us, having, 54 years before, landed there and planted the English flag. We gave 3 cheers for that great British navigator, and also for Commander Sven Foynd, who so bravely sent out this present Antarctic expedition. So it appears that, unlike Captain Christensen, Borchgrevink realised they had landed on Possession Island. Leaving the rest of the party to entertain the penguins, Borchgrevink wandered off alone and to his surprise found a species of lichen growing amongst the rocks about 10 metres above sea level. This profound discovery completely overturned the prevailing theory of botanists that the rigour of Antarctic winter was fatal to all vegetable life. Borchgrevink climbed to the highest peak and named it after Archibald Archer, a government minister and member of the famous Queensland pioneering family. Archibald's older brother, William, had moved to Norway in the 1860s and may have crossed paths with Carsten when he was a young boy. Borchgrevink also collected a suite of rocks. 11 were examined and described by the magnificently named Sir Jethro Justinian Harris Teal, petrologist and later director of the Geological Survey of England and Wales, who described them as hornblende basalt. Borchgrevink gave a lecture on the expedition in Sydney in April 1895. Among the attendees was Edgeworth David, Professor of Geology at Sydney University. Borchgrevink gave 10 of his Possession Island rock samples to a delighted Edgeworth David, who assembled a team to examine the rocks. Professor David delivered a preliminary report on their findings to the Royal Society of New South Wales a few months later, in August 1895, concluding that the rocks were of continental origin and that therefore Antarctica was a continent, as first proposed by Lieutenant Wilkes in 1840. Professor David stated that it is impossible to overestimate the importance of Mr. Borchgrevink's work on the whole subject of the geography and geology of Antarctica, and we express to him our warmest thanks for his courtesy in allowing us the privilege of examining and describing his collections. Most, if not all, the rocks given to Professor David were passed on by him to John Walter Gregory, Professor of Geology at the University of Melbourne. When Gregory was appointed as Professor at the University of Glasgow in 1904, he took the rocks with him, where they disappeared into the bowels of the museum collection until they were rediscovered in 2001. It is highly likely that David's determination to visit Antarctica, which he later achieved as a member of Shackleton's Nimrod expedition of 1907 to 1909, was stimulated by his association with Carsten Borchgrevink. After 3 hours on Possession Island, the landing party set off to return to their ship at midnight, highly delighted with their trip, bringing with them a collection of penguins as well as Borchgrevink's rocks and samples of guano. Before they left, Captain Christensen marked their landing spot, erecting a pole well supported by big stones, to which was nailed a box. Inside he placed a cigarette tin with a note summarising their voyage. The rock pile and wooden post are significant, being the oldest physical structures erected by humans south of the Antarctic Circle. It was used by subsequent explorers as a sort of post office. Captain Christensen incorrectly believed that the southern large island was the one on which James Ross had landed, so Christensen named it James Ross Island. The errors were incorporated in an article by Sir Clements Markham, published in the prestigious literary magazine, The 19th Century, in October 1895, shortly after the return of the Antarctic voyagers, which he based on a report by Captain Christensen. Regrettably, these mistakes were perpetuated in the New Zealand Provisional Gazetteer of the Ross Dependency and subsequently in the Antarctic Treaty List of Historic Places. The Australian Antarctic Data Centre still completely confuses the names of the Possession Islands. If these agencies are so utterly wrong about something so well documented, you have to wonder about the accuracy of the other records held by these supposedly authoritative bureaucracies. Pleas to correct the record started as long ago as 1896 by Henrik Bull and Carsten Borchgrevink. through the next 125 years to the 2020s by experts such as archaeologist Dr. David Harrowfield and glaciologist Dr. Mark Maben of New Zealand. Apart from the United States, bureaucracies in the UK, Australia, New Zealand and the United Nations have refused to correct their mistakes. New Zealand has never published detailed topographic maps of the islands, relying on 1958 and 1963 aerial surveys of the coast of Victoria Land completed by the US Navy. The 1968 published 1 to 250,000 scale Cape Adare topographic sheet resulted from those surveys. Several other names for islands and features in the archipelago were proposed by Henrik Bull and other members of the Antarctic expedition. These include Griffiths Peak and Kerno Peak, Archer Peak, Borchgrevink Peak and Cape von Muller. Of all these suggestions, shamefully, only Archer Peak has been officially retained. The most southerly island of the group, Henrik Bull named Hefties Island, after the Norwegian banker and part owner of the vessel, and this name has also been retained. The United States Geological Survey's 1 to 250,000 scale topographic map of Cape Adare fortunately shows the archipelago with the islands correctly located and named. The northernmost, Possession Island, is also the largest, encompassing 308 hectares. It is 2.3 kilometres long by 1.8 kilometres wide and quite low, more than half being less than 50 metres above sea level. The eastern two-thirds of Possession Island is a gentle plateau, nearly half covered by permanent snow and ice. The highest parts of the plateau, at about 50 metres elevation, are along the steep cliffs at the eastern edge. To the west of the plateau is a ridge. The northern part has gentle slopes up to 70 metres elevation, while the southern half is spectacularly rugged and rises to 95 metres elevation at Archer Peak. The ridge is formed by a dike of basalt about 50 metres thick that dips 35 degrees eastward and is well exposed in the sea cliffs. The east slope of the ridge is the stripped upper surface of the dike. Beneath the dike, or perhaps part of it, is a pillow lava complex. A distinctive north-south fault separates the rugged western third of the island from a rolling platform formed of nearly horizontal basalts that rises gently eastward to the top of the sea cliffs 30 to 50 metres high. The basalts include tuff layers that contain polished beach pebbles, suggesting cinder cones erupted into a beach and littoral environment. The third topographic feature is a 30-hectare sized beach on the western side of the island. This triangular-shaped cuspate foreland comprises 6 or 7 southeast to northwest oriented beach ridges, about 40 metres wide and separated by shallow swales. The crests of the ridges are 8 to 10 metres above sea level. The beach is one of the few easily accessible landing places in the archipelago, hence its popularity with the Adelie penguins. The second biggest island, Foyne Island, is 2 kilometres long by 1.6 kilometres wide and is a much higher landmass than Possession Island, with some 57% of its area above 50 metres elevation. The highest point, variously estimated at between 100 and 105 metres, is St Marie Peak at the north end of Foyne Island. The peak was named by the United States Advisory Committee on Antarctic Names for Lieutenant Commander John St Marie, US Navy, co-pilot on the Squadron VX-6 flight of January 18, 1958, at which time the Possession Islands and this feature were photographed. The main part of the island is a relatively rugged block covering 140 hectares and supporting several permanent snow and ice areas. The southwest corner, covering about 45 hectares, is lower, less than 45 metres, and has gentler topography, occupied by penguins in the places where it is ice-free. Counting using oblique aerial photos over 6 seasons from 1981 to 2012 indicates an average 30,000 breeding pairs of Adelie penguins occupy Foyne Island each summer, compared to 111,000 for Possession Island, and that over this period those populations were fairly stable. Foyne Island is made up of basalt flows and cinder cone deposits intruded by a massive basaltic body showing spectacular radial columnar jointing, as well as pillow lavas, just like Possession Island. These units are overlain by a post-erosional mantle of basaltic cinders. A standing basalt column at the northwestern tip of Foyne Island looks like the sculpture of a figure, perhaps Sven Foyne himself. The whole Possession archipelago lies within the Hallett volcanic province, part of the McMurdo volcanic group. The volcanic centres within the group range from small scoria cones and flows covering a few tens of square metres up to the enormous bulk of Mount Erebus, estimated at 1,800 cubic kilometres. Mount Melbourne and Mount Erebus are active volcanoes, and many other centres are dormant. Coolman Island is a well-preserved volcanic centre typical of the province. The Possession Islands could be the remnant fragments of a similar volcanic edifice. The preserved parts are interpreted to have been formed near the vent region of an initially very large volcanic pile. The greater fluidity of magma near the vent and the smaller proportion of breccia within it may have facilitated the formation of the mega pillows and the magnificent columnar basalt flows. Apart from the 2 main islands, there are 7 other much smaller remnants of this postulated large stratovolcano. From north to south, these start with Dixon Pillar, which lies just off the southeast corner of Possession Island. It was named for Lieutenant Commander Paul Bevis Dixon, a photographer with the US Navy Squadron VX-6. Dixon Pillar is a sea stack composed of basalt, once part of Possession Island, but the softer units have eroded away, leaving it isolated. West and East Christensen Rocks lie about 1,300 metres south of Dixon Pillar. The north face of East Christensen Rock has been sheared off at an angle of about 45 degrees, while the south face shows large basalt columns about 50 metres high. West Christensen Rock is about 170 metres long and 25 metres wide. It has two impressive sea arches that have attracted attention since James Clark Ross passed by in 1841. Named for US Marine Robert Favreau, navigator of the US Navy air photographic flight that first filmed the islands, Favreau Pillar sits adjacent to the eastern tip of Foyne Island. This dramatic columnar basalt sea stack is 65 metres high, but less than 25 metres in diameter. South of Foyne Island, two large adjacent sea stacks have been named as islands, Bull Island and Hefti Island. They are much smaller than the two main islands and are the southernmost of the Possession Islands group. Bull Island, named after Henrik Bull, is a rugged block some 800 metres long by 200 metres wide, made up of brecciated basalt flows and pillows. A separate sea stack at the eastern end is named Kemp Rock, after William Kemp, US Navy photographer with the VX-6 squadron. Hefti Island is about 300 metres wide and 80 metres high. The north face displays irregular mega-pillows on the right that merge into interswirled scoria, breccia and lava on the left. After naming some of the islands, the Norwegian expedition sailed south from the Possession Islands as far as latitude 74 degrees 10 south. Finding no whales, Captain Christensen turned the ship north. On the 24th of January they passed close to Cape Adare. The weather was exceptionally calm, the area unaffected by ice or currents, so Captain Christensen launched a boat, and with Henrik Bull, Carsten Borchgrevink and 4 other seamen, achieved the first deliberate landing on the Antarctic continent. Christensen erected a pole at the landing site to which was attached a box, and on that was painted the Norwegian flag. Messages were left inside. The ship then sailed back to Melbourne, where Antarctic arrived on the 12th of March 1895. 4 years later, Borchgrevink returned to Cape Adare as leader of the British Antarctic expedition on the steam yacht Southern Cross. His land party was the first to winter over on the Antarctic continent. My YouTube video on Cape Adare describes aspects of the pioneering Southern Cross expedition. On the 2nd of February 1900, just 2 weeks short of a year since they had landed at Ridley Beach, these Southern Cross expeditioners departed Cape Adare and sailed for Possession Island. Next morning they stopped there briefly to add a message to the box that Leonard Christensen had erected 5 years before. His message was found in a tobacco box nailed to the post and in a perfect state of preservation. The letter was short and merely stated that the ship Antarctic, Captain Christensen, had called there on the 18th of January 1895. After having placed a pencilled note signed by each member of the party in the tin box, it was again secured. During the 1 hour spent ashore, photographs were taken by the expedition's physicist and magnetic observer Louis Benacchi, who walked with Borchgrevink to the interior of the island, reaching near the summit of Archer Peak. 7 of those photographs were published in Borchgrevink's expedition account, showing the island was under a heavy snow cover at the time. Rocks, vegetation, and several young skuas were collected. The Southern Cross continued south, exploring the Great Ice Barrier and reaching latitude 78°34 degrees, the furthest south ever achieved until then, before heading for Hobart via New Zealand. 2 years after Borchgrevink's departure, on the 8th of January 1902, the British National Antarctic Expedition under Commander Robert Falcon Scott penetrated the ice pack and entered the open water of the Great Bay east of Victoria Land, now known as the Ross Sea. This superbly resourced expedition, in a brand new purpose-built Royal Research ship Discovery, was science-based and included Australian geophysicist Louis Benacki, British geologist Hartley Ferrar, naturalist Thomas Hodgson, and biologist Dr. Edward Wilson. The crew included Sub-Lieutenant Ernest Shackleton on his first voyage to the south. The story of the Discovery expedition will be explored in more detail in a forthcoming video. Discovery called in at Cape Adare, where Scott left a message signalling their intentions in Borchgrevink's hut. Bypassing the Possession Island post office, Discovery traversed the Great Ice Barrier before settling on Hut Point in McMurdo Sound as the site for their winter quarters. The following year, on the 8th of January 1903, the expedition's relief ship, the steam yacht Morning, under Captain William Colbeck, called in at Cape Adare and found Scott's message, which gave no information on his whereabouts, but basically said that all on board Discovery were well. Morning continued on to Possession Island, landing at 4 p.m, hoping to find information on Scott's intentions in the post office. This was the 4th recorded landing on Possession Island, and it lasted less than 2 hours. John Douglas Morrison, the ship's engineer, who took photographs of the landing, reported, "I walked a mile to the post office, a post stuck on a hill. I got to the post, took a photo, and broke open the letterbox." No message from Discovery was found, so they took Borchgrevink's 1900 note and left their own record on the conspicuous and well-chosen mark. Geological samples were taken from nearby cliffs, while the ship's doctor stole 2 young penguins. Morning eventually found Discovery a month later, held fast in the ice at Hut Point. After resupplying the expedition, Morning returned to New Zealand, with Shackleton suffering from scurvy as a passenger. For the next 50 years, the Possession Islands were forgotten. In 1955, as part of the preparations for participation by the United States in the Antarctic program for the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58, the US Navy Task Force 43, under the command of Antarctic veteran Rear Admiral George Dufek, established 2 bases in Antarctica, a naval air facility in McMurdo Sound, and a scientific station called Little America 5 at Canaan Bay on the eastern flank of the Ross Ice Shelf. Task Force 43 comprised 1,800 men in 7 ships, including 2 Navy icebreakers, USS Glacier, the largest and most powerful icebreaker in the world at that time, and USS Edisto, a Wind-class icebreaker commissioned in 1947. As the ice runway at McMurdo neared completion, which was accomplished on the 19th of December 1955, Task Force 43 ships on their way south broke off in turn to form a picket line, with ships stationed at roughly 500-kilometre intervals along the route from Christchurch, New Zealand, to guide aircraft on their 14-hour journey to McMurdo. 8 aircraft departed Christchurch on the 20th of December. As the 2 pairs of smaller R4Ds and Albatross UFs were drawing near the point of no return, with fuel dwindling at an alarming rate due to strong headwinds, it was obvious, though disappointing, that they would never make McMurdo Sound. They were ordered to turn back to Christchurch. The 2 long-range P2V Neptune and 2 R5D Skymaster aircraft winged their way without difficulty, and by 10 p.m. local time had all safely landed on sea ice in McMurdo Sound. On the 5th of February 1956, Rear Admiral Dufek ordered the icebreaker USS Edisto to carry out a reconnaissance mission to find a site for a weather and air reporting station, and a location for a suitable emergency landing strip on the coast of northern Victoria Land, around 600 kilometres north of the McMurdo runway, which the Navy had named Williams Field. USS Edisto arrived at Cape Adare on the 9th of February 1956 to investigate its possibilities as a station site. However, 50-knot winds and a high surf made landing hazardous. A landing party skirted the entire beach just outside the breakers in an LCVP, or Landing Craft Vehicles and Personnel. It was almost impossible to see the top of the beach through the flying snowdrift. The skipper decided not to risk a landing. The next day, Edisto's whaleboat tried to land, but was overturned by the surf just as it hit the beach. It was finally towed off by the LCVP, while the drenched crew were rescued by helicopter, a ticklish and risky manoeuvre in the high winds. Cape Adare was rejected as a station site, so the ship headed south. Late in the evening of the 11th of February 1956, USS Edisto launched another party in an LCVP to attempt a landing on Possession Island. However, it was caught by a large swell when approaching the beach, broached, and had to be abandoned. A severe storm with 60-knot winds resulted in the 7-man crew being left ashore. Salvage attempts using all the other Edisto boats and finally the ship itself continued through the night. They became the first party to spend a night on Possession Island. All personnel were eventually recovered using a rubber life raft and a line throwing gun. Years later, meteorologist Rubin recalled that for those ashore, no food had been brought, no radio, no tent, no water, nothing, and all they could do for warmth was to keep walking. The wreckage is still there, high on the beach. Despite their immense historical importance, especially to New Zealand, the taking of possession by Ross in 1841 leading to New Zealand's claim to the Ross Dependency, and also as the site of the first rock samples to prove the existence of an Antarctic continent, as well as the site of the first vegetation found in Antarctica, the Possession Islands have been sadly neglected by New Zealand. No scientific paper has ever been published that specifically focuses on the Possession Islands. Instead, they have become relatively frequent destinations for tourist ships since the early 1990s. 10 times more tourists have visited the islands in 30 years than scientists have visited in the last 180 years. The lack of scientific knowledge of the islands not only detracts from the visitor experience, some of whom understandably don't even know which island they are on, but also poses a risk in not being able to monitor properly the potential environmental effects of these visitor numbers in the absence of baseline information. Tourists pay the New Zealand government a lot of money for the privilege of visiting these islands, even though sometimes it is just as fraught with difficulty as it was for the earlier explorers. Tourists deserve a better bang for their buck.